will give a quick introduction and then you can take over. So good afternoon, Professor Hans Fuchs. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's HBCSE seminar, where Professor Hans Fuchs will talk to those here at Homi Bhabha Center on how narrative does scientific work. As Hans points out, narrative and storytelling have become buzzwords in modern life. Everything in politics, economics, art, and the reporting of mundane events seems to be about telling a good story. The talk will take us through a good number of uses of narrative and storytelling in science in general and in physical science in particular, and will be premised upon one: science itself may be understood as the grand narrative of human culture and meaning of knowledge. Two, we can tell narratives about science for creating context for motivating learners. Three, there is narrative supporting science learning. And finally, the fourth one, there is narrative as science, where narrative creates explanations, allows for the creation and use of models, and suggests concepts. After briefly reviewing some of these uses and outlining a theoretical background material in physics, figurative language, and narratology, Professor Fuchs will elaborate on narrative as science, where narrative creates explanation, and sketch how narrative can be instrumental in doing scientific work and what that might mean for philosophy of science and learning physics. The learning implication for science education and physics education in particular is that the talk puts forward is that physics should not be taught simply as a well-structured formal body of fixed and immutable knowledge. Rather, learning environments should be constructed where students work on real-life investigations, which include experimenting, data acquisition, data handling, narrative description of phenomena, model construction, and simulations, including model validation. And what we usually call theory will then be the end result, the collected wisdom of such activity and learning. Coming to the speaker, Professor Hans Fuchs studied physics at ETH Zurich and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, New York, before working in industry. Starting in 1983, he joined Zurich University of Applied Sciences at Winterthur, where he was a professor of physics and systems design. After retirement in 2017, he joined the faculty at the Free University of Bolzano as a lecturer in primary physics education. His recent work encompasses physics education research, cognitive linguistics, and theory of narrative in science, much of it applied to the education of young learners. His former work, apart from teaching engineering students, concerned the foundations of thermodynamics as a theory of dynamical systems and thermal design, which he mentioned as one aspect which motivated him to turn to cognitive science and narrative science. He is the author of textbooks, The Dynamics of Heat, a Unified Approach to Thermodynamics and Heat Transfer, published by Springer, and Modeling of another textbook, Modeling of Uniform Dynamical Systems. Over to you, Professor Fuchs.
Okay, thank you very much, Mashoud, for your kind introduction. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Allow me to say something quickly. I'm going to share my screen in a minute. I will just have the button to unshare to go back to this screen if something comes up that we want to discuss. So I would encourage you to interrupt me if certain things strike your mind as, you know, this is worth saying a few more words. Simply speak up and I'll try and answer your question right away. But again, we have time for questions at the end of this talk. Okay, I'll share my screen. All right. Stories are forces of nature. How narrative does scientific work? I'm mostly interested in using stories of forces of nature where, well, the forces of nature come alive and give us a narrative way of understanding what these forces do in nature and in technical devices. In other words, I'm interested in how narrative can give us access to modeling and simulation, to actually understanding the conceptual aspects of science. Now, science, I said science, I'm a physicist. I cannot speak for chemists or biologists. I do a little bit of chemical processes as part of continuum physics, but that's about it. Okay, I'd like to thank two colleagues who I've been working with for quite a number of years, Federico Corni in Italy and Elisabeth Dumont here in Winterthur, and in particular, my wife, who has written stories of forces of nature with me and has illustrated a couple of them. Here, a very brief overview of what I would like to speak about. Point one, a description of forms of narrative, a little bit of background concerning narrative stories and storytelling in general. You might say independently of whether or not we are interested in science, but naturally my outlook is always toward using this in science. I will say only a very few words about different uses of narrative in science. Is a great range of possible applications and therefore also forms of narrative in science. As I said, I'm interested in a particular aspect of all of this. What I've done is I've put together a more detailed description of the four fields of application which I see, and I've written up all the literature for you in these slides, as I believe you will have access to these slides. You can have them, so you have access to a lot of literature which I have consulted in this overview. Okay, then I will first present an example of a narrative approach. In fact, I'm using the example of photosynthesis. I've been motivated doing this by a paper of Mashoud and colleagues. And then finally, I try to summarize what this means for narrative, for stories that do scientific conceptual work. Okay, I believe it is important that I say a few words about what is the very general background of what I do. So when you think about this, if you're interested in this, you should criticize my approach. You should criticize what I'm saying. In order to be able to criticize, you should know what my basic thinking is concerning narrative in science. One point concerning the science itself, the physical science itself, I use generalized continuum physics, modern continuum physics that was created in the second half of the 20th century as the scientific basis of what I'm thinking about. So there are no small particles roaming through empty space. In particular, mechanics is not the foundation of everything else. The different fields of continuum physics are on par. You can use analogy in order to move from one of the fields to the other. So it's not like one of them, say motion mechanics, is the prototype for everything else. Cognitive science, I have learned a great deal about cognitive linguistics, especially metaphor theory, and this was my early engagement with cognitive science when I started to get that feeling that the way we speak about science, at least speak about science, but probably also do science, is imaginative, and imaginative in the sense of us using metaphors, analogy, and also narrative. All of this leads to philosophy of mind. My point of departure is what might be called the embodied model of the human mind, or enactivism. Assumptions or claims that arise from this kind of background are maybe these here. Imagination is a driving force of mind. Basically, I would say physics is an imaginative product, and the product of our imagination. We experience activity in nature as gestalts of forces of nature. Our perception, our experience perception leads to the construction of what I call forces of nature. You will hear quite a bit about this notion of forces of nature in this talk. In experience, as we experience the world around us, be it the physical world or be it the social world, other humans, etc., etc., this leads to the creation of schematic mental structures, shapes, figures, image schemas. Such image schemas that are usually projected metaphorically onto other fields. These schematic elements, image schemas, they arise mainly in our sensory motor experience. So there's a lot of spatial, temporal, schematic stuff that populates our mind, and these schemas, they are used in order to understand things that are not per se related to this type of sensory motoric experience. It can be anything that's very abstract. It can be political concepts, can be psychological concepts, and for us, importantly, all the other fields of experience of physical nature. And finally, our mind works narratively. I can show you briefly that how macroscopic physical theories have a narrative structure, have a metaphoric and narrative structure. I'll quickly jump to this appendix here. When you get the files, you can do this too, and you can look at things a little more carefully. This should help you to maybe see some of the things, some of the ideas, concepts, etc., which I'm using in my thinking and in my talk today. If you are somebody who likes to start working in science by writing down equations, being fully formally oriented, take a look at these equations. These are two equations of balance, one for substances and one for entropy. Caloric, by the way, when I speak with non-scientists, I would call entropy caloric. I have this, I use imaginative ways of giving people an impression of what we're speaking about in formal scientific applications. Anyway, if you just very quickly look at the equations, they're perfectly analogous. The structure, the formal structure is the same. Interestingly, there's a lot more than just formal structure there. There is imaginative structure. For example, you have density of substances or entropy. In other words, you have the impression of something like a fluid-like substance that is contained in an area, in a material or in space, and therefore there's a density of this. This substance-like quantity can flow. It flows into and out of these such areas. The flow can be conductive or convective, and it is possible that in some cases, some of these substance-like quantities, they can be produced and or destroyed. Chemical species emit positive and negative production rates, and entropy caloric emits a zero or positive production rate. So if you combine these images that are in there, you may represent what is usually very formal, either in words or with sketches like the one at the bottom of this page here. You can continue all of this. For example, you can see that conductive transports are driven by a gradient. A gradient is like a hillside in an environment. These substance-like quantities by themselves, they flow downhill. If you want them to go uphill, you have to do something, you have to pump them. But maybe you hear in my language, I really use natural everyday language to speak about these things that for physicists are usually completely formal, but I'm convinced that behind all this formalism, there are images with which we can work. Okay, so that much about the background here. So allow me to just do one more thing quickly about schemas, how schemas come up. This is something that happens to us from early life on. I have 3 drawings my grandson Dario produced when he was between 4 and 4.5 years old. The left one he called Dangerous Energy. That was when he was interested in volcanoes. It's possible what he has there is a magma chamber and stuff flowing out at the top and something inside there, and the schematic stuff. Anyway, he called that dangerous energy. The second one, he loved to build bridges and then destroy them to the song London Bridge is Falling Down. He did this for weeks, and then all of a sudden he goes to the blackboard and draws this and says, this is bridge over water. What you have here is an abstraction, a very strong abstraction of, in this case, an object. In the first one, dangerous energy, you have an abstraction, a schematic rendering of something which is not physical. And on the right, you have something like a combination. He lives in a place where a major power line crosses Switzerland, and he knows these towers, these electric towers. And so he drew this imaging with the cables in between. And then there's this funny structure in the middle. He drew the same picture again with fire in its place. And he said, this here in the middle is where electricity works. So you see how abstractions arise through schematism. And this is much of what I use when I try to represent physical science in an imaginative manner. Okay, so let's speak a little bit about this, about narrative itself. First point, aspects and forms of narrative. Very generally, narrative is one of the forms of figurative embodied communication. We use narrative, particularly stories, when recounting large-scale events and processes. I'll say something about scale in a minute. Figurative embodied communication tied to smaller scale events and processes uses metaphor and analogy. Basically, what we see arising here is that the language in stories is metaphoric and uses analogy. This is how these tie together, metaphor, analogy, and narrative. Maybe we can say that narrative is used when we have a large scale, temporally, spatially, and or systemically large experience. Maybe we live through a hurricane, through a storm, something like that, the birth of a child. Whereas the language in that story uses all these schematic elements, projects them metaphorically. And what you communicate there is usually smaller elements that are part of the larger story, which talks about the larger experience. Okay, I'll tell you a little bit something about narratology as it has developed in the last 10, 20 years or so. There's now a field of cognitive narratology as well as narrative linguistics. I'm using David Herman's work. He says that narrative is a radio category. Well, you probably know this yourself. If you're new to narrative in science, narrative really is not just one single simple thing which everybody knows exactly how it is. There are different forms of narrative. And once we see that it's clear, we have to start talking about this. What do we mean when we speak about narrative? In particular, what is the meaning of story? Herman calls story the prototypical element of the larger category or family of narrative. In science itself, we do not just make use of stories. In fact, probably most scientists don't use story per se, but they might use explanatory narratives or narrative explanations, especially when they teach. Stories themselves, if you want to use a story, if you want to create and or use a story, it's important to be aware what makes this the central element of the category. Stories, they include all of the following elements: events, experiencing of events by agents, tensions for creating events, and reasons or occasions for telling by a narrator. Let me start with the last point, reasons or occasions for telling by a narrator. Well, that would be, for example, that would be the teacher. having a reason for wanting to present something, whatever it is, in her science to her students in the form of a story. The first point is the stories about events, and physics is also about events, so that's fine. But what about agents? What about tensions for creating events that produce in our mind the forces, the driving forces of events? Well, you will see, I hope I can make this clear in this talk, that events, tensions, and agents populate our stories in the physical, definitely in the physical science. Okay, I'm not going to go into detail here. I put together the following slides mainly just to point out a few aspects that are important, might be interesting for you, so you can read up on this. You find the literature mentioned. This Marco Caracciolo has written a very nice book about the experientiality of narrative, describing in great detail how reading or hearing a story creates a kind of experience that parallels direct physical experience. So in education, you might, for instance, say that the combination of direct physical experience of nature and the hearing of stories that leads to narrative experience, the combined experience that happens there is a driving force of understanding and education. This education theorist, Kieran Egan, has written a lot about the use of story for especially the education of younger children. Just 2 points here, which he mentions. Stories are usually set up by polarities, by the tensions that are created in polarities, good and bad, dark and light, hot and cold. You see polarities appear in nature as well, not just in our psyche and in our social environments. So we might be able to use polarities, for instance, the polarity of hot and cold, to tell a story about heat. And stories, they lead to the development of one's conception of causality. Behind this feeling of causality is the feeling of agency. And as I said before, you will hear a number of things about agents that populate physical science as well. Back to David Herman, he writes about something very important that has been very important for me in this, in how I would like to explain how narrative, how stories are used in scientific work. Even if we're not aware of this, that as scientists we do narrative work here, but it is narrative. Hearing or reading a story leads to the creation in our minds of story worlds, and he calls story worlds mental models. You might say you read a novel of somebody, a couple of characters, main characters living in a city, interacting with each other in the city. The city environment would be the story world environment, plus the way the agents interact with that environment and with each other all of that constitutes the mental model that Herman calls a story world. The story world is instrumental for us in understanding what the characters, the agents, are doing in this novel. Quickly about the language in narrative. Importantly, this language is metaphoric. Caracciolo writes, as suggested by David Lodge, narrative and literature have a special tool for showing readers how to enact a given experience, to get this narrative experience through enaction. And that tool is metaphorical language. Through metaphors and similes, the reader is invited to imagine experiences both of acting and of being acted upon. All right. Let me summarize all of this. The claims are stories are prototypical narratives telling about events created by tensions and experienced by agents. Narrative is experienced by us when we hear or read this. Experience is enacted. Stories are set up by polarities and develop the notion of causality. Experiencing narrative lets us create story worlds. And through metaphors and similes and narratives, the reader is invited to imagine experiences both of acting and of being acted upon. Okay, second point, and this is very brief. I wrote this in the notes which I sent to you, that there are a large number of possible applications. I read a lot, and what I did is I tried to create a little bit of order in my mind, and I came up with this scheme here of 4 different fields of uses of narrative. And as I said before, my main interest is in the 4th of these. Now, for your benefit, what I did is I expanded on this table here. So there are 4 entries expanding on these 4 parts of the category of narrative in science, and I put together much of the literature which I used as I studied this field. Okay, that's all I would like to say here. Okay, third point, I'm now going to use an example of storytelling, of forms of storytelling. There are different forms, but they are all in a certain way types of storytelling. The example I chose, I've been motivated to do this, to include this, because of work done by your group. Okay, I'm referring to this paper, Teacher in Action, Modeling How Teachers Build New Mechanism Concepts in Students' Minds. And on the first page of that paper, we see an example of a mechanism, namely photosynthesis. So I'm going to see if I can show to you how to get to photosynthesis, to representing photosynthesis in a narrative manner. But I have to expand a little bit. I'm using a different example first. Imagine a simple technical example. Technical examples are much simpler than natural ones because they usually don't have the complexity, for example, of a tree, of an entire tree in its environment. Imagine you have a little electric motor, a little pump, and you're pumping water from a lower into a higher reservoir. electric motor and pump are connected by an axle, but they are mounted on the floor, on the table, or whatever. You have wires, you have hoses. This is basically what you see. Now, how does an explanation go that uses metaphoric, analogical, and finally narrative forms of rendering? Take a look at the second diagram here at the bottom of this slide. I call this a process diagram. What is happening, what we need to do in order to get to stories, to a narrative, imaginative narrative rendering of what we believe we understand here, you have to let the material objects of the system you're interested in move to the background of the ground. They become the ground. You make a figure ground reversal, and you see agents appearing before this ground. Okay, these agents are still rather schematic here. You will hear more about this. The agents are, you could call them electricity, heat, rotational motion, water, and so on. You have to let them arise in your mind, for example, in the form of fluid-like quantities. For example, electrical charge would be the fluid-like quantity of electricity as the character, as one of the characters active in this system. Now, what does this fluid-like quantity do in our system? It flows into the electric motor and out again. It flows in at a high electric level, as if you have an image as if we were in an electrical landscape. It flows in at high level, comes out at low level, and the difference of levels is what humans feel as a tension. Okay, something else is happening. We know that the agent we might call electricity is powerful. What does that mean? Well, in physical science, we render power through the notion of energy. It means the following: this powerful agent delivers energy, carries energy to the area, which is the electric motor, and then makes it available. This green fat arrow pointing down in the rectangle of the electric motor, the first one of these, is the symbol I invented for making energy available at a certain rate. This is what I call power. Power shows in the interaction of agents. In the electric motor, electricity interacts with rotational motion. So what is happening here is a part of the energy that has been made available by the agent is picked up by one of the patients. An agent that is being caused, that is being driven, is called a patient. Okay. Interestingly, only a part of the energy is picked up, is used for pumping spin from a lower to a higher rotational level. The other part is used to produce entropy, which would be the fluid-like quantity of the thermal agent at work here, and so on and so on. We go over to the mechanical water pump. Spin makes energy available, which is used by water. Water is being pumped from the lower, driven from the lower to a higher potential. Here you see the schematic elements that are being used. It's always exactly the same schematic elements that are used for all forces of nature that have appeared here. In other words, this is the root of analogy. The schematic rendering of each of these basic phenomena is the same, meaning our mind creates a similarity between these totally different phenomena, which then allows us to make use of analogical reasoning. I don't know if you would agree that what I did before is already something like telling a story. Namely, I'm talking about these agents: electricity, rotation, water, heat. Now, we have invented a way of acting out such stories in theater-like environments with kids. What you need is enough of a floor space. You label a couple of areas as electrical, motor, mechanical pump. You divide the children you're teaching in several groups, each group representing a force of nature, being agents. And now imagine an agent, a kid, can represent two fundamental aspects of such an agent, namely their size. They can grow or become smaller, and maybe by bodily or facial expression, they can express attention. Now, we give the children confetti or maybe sand in their hands. When they receive confetti in their hands and carry this around, they are tensed up there. They grow, they move around, they make their confetti or sand available to a waiting child representing a different force of nature. And these children then, they become tensed up, they carry their confetti to the next area, etc., etc. So really a story is being enacted here. And now finally on to photosynthesis. A process diagram of photosynthesis would look like this. You have substances, a group of substances coming together, light, water, and CO2. Together they're at a certain chemical potential, which is higher than that of the chemicals that are being produced, carbohydrates and oxygen. And as before, light, water, CO2, together they bring so and so much energy, which they make available. And the energy then is used for follow-up processes. Now, if you would like to see a story told, here's one my wife and I produced for as a part of a European project we did the last 2-3 years, an apple story, which roughly goes like this. It talks about a child and her friends that are active, that are hungry. At the beginning, Anna is hungry. She gets an apple. At the end, she and her friends are playing in their garden. They pick apples and eat and get energy. And in the middle of this story, we have something like this figure ground reversal I talked about before. We have a subplot where all of a sudden nature becomes alive, becomes the forces of nature become the characters of these of this story. And so on a few pages, my wife and I talk in everyday language, in natural language, what these natural agents are doing. Okay, just one brief remark, because Mashoud and his colleagues, what I have seen from you, you very often speak about dealing with mechanisms. I just wanted to point out that there is an entire new field of the philosophy of mechanisms in the philosophy of science, which is worth taking a look at. I personally believe that mechanisms are one stage in a sequence of activities, actions we take as we try to understand natural and technical systems and processes. You go from systems themselves to mechanisms in systems. You try and build up models, dynamical models of such mechanisms, and the models, they tell us stories. Anyway, with this, I'm now at this point where I can tell you something how stories of forces of nature actually do scientific work. Let me give you an overview of the last few points I would like to make today. In macroscopic physical systems and processes, our mind creates the imagery of forces of nature. I'll say a few more words about this in a minute. This expresses the view that we experience agentive phenomena in nature and machines as forces of nature. In such experience, forces of nature appear as agents. We can tell stories of the adventures of these agents. If this is true, if the second point is true, then we have one of the very important elements of what humans need in order to, well, be narratively active, in order to create stories. Hearing a story lets us narratively experience the characters of such agents and their relation to their environments, and so create a story world. Experiencing such characteristics as exemplified in the story worlds allows us to model mechanisms. So if we get to the point of letting a story world about nature and the forces of nature arise in our mind, we have tools for model creation. And then finally, running such models, simulating them, is like telling a story anew. Each simulation is like telling a story, which again, now maybe you see the feedback, maybe enhances our story world in our mind, maybe corrects it, enlarges it, whatever. Very briefly about forces of nature, just examples. You've seen some, but for kids in particular, wind, rain, fire, light, heat and cold, lightning, water, air, food, gravity, motion, these are all forces of nature in the sense in which the basic group is treated in continuum physics. There you have fluids, electricity and magnetism, heat, substances, gravitation, linear motion, and rotational motion. And as I have been trying to stress here, is our power of imagination allows us to render the physical theories in these figurative, imaginative, metaphoric, and narrative forms. The experience gives us three basic aspects or characteristics of these forces of natures. You have seen this in my example. Intensity is an important aspect. That's what physicists call the potentials. Potentials are intensity. Extension, spatial size or amount of stuff. For example, wind has a spatial size. The extension of wind is spatially characterized. The extension of heat, for instance, is characterized by the amount of entropy which you have in processes. And finally, the power of these agents, which we then render formal in our science through the energy principle. I'm not going to go into detail here. This is just for you if you want to have a little bit more information about now what are these analogical concepts that are being introduced for the different forces of nature. Here you have this table. Note on the very right here, energy has the same characteristics for all of them. There are no different forms of energy. Energy is not converted from one form into another. The relationship of each of these forces of nature with energy is of the same form. The images, the formulas, whether or not you do it through images or formally through formulas, the relationship between energy and these different forces of nature is always the same, which allows us to use analogy. This is a diagram that explains how analogy arises. We have different experiences, maybe of heat and of water. These experiences are rendered with the schematic elements, which we have learned as children. They create this generic space, and they bring the two input spaces of fluids and heat together in our mind and create what we might call an analogy. Okay, so stories are doing conceptual work. Let me come back to this one more time. Basically, I've said it, so let me summarize it briefly. How are stories of forces of nature possible at all? If you remember what David Herman said about what makes a story, tensions, events, tensions, and agents, just consult your own language or that of your colleagues or that of just people on the street, where the street might be the internet, where you Google how people, anybody, speaks about phenomena, for example, about the phenomenon of heat. And if you are aware of the metaphoric nature of that language, you realize that we speak of intensities, tensions, levels, and in particular, we speak of agents, of forces, forces rendered as agents, and the agents being more or less powerful. So in our language, we see all these basic schematic elements I've talked about, and they are used in order to speak about our experience. I'm not going to go into this. This is about explaining the process of figure ground reversal and how it applies to a natural science. Just very quickly, here you will find access to two animated stories of forces of nature, which a young art student has created a few years ago. Marion Deichmann. This is the second one, which she did with us for the European project on fuel cells and hydrogen. And the story has the same structure as the Apple story. It's a basic story where things are going on physically, there's a beginning and an end, but there are subplots in the story where all of a sudden we make this figure ground reversal, where forces of nature appear as agents before the material background, and we learn about these forces of nature by making this figure ground reversal ourselves and accepting that these forces, these agents are active and learning in what way they are active. Yes, and that brings me to the final point, to, if you will, the summary, a diagram which I use to explain how narrative, how story in science works in analogy to how a novel works for us when we want to move ourselves into a fantasy world. Okay, you remember the diagram on the left. story world, not the story itself. We tell stories against the background of a story world. Or in reverse, if we hear a story, we create the story world. So there's this feedback loop between stories, telling and hearing, and creating story worlds in our mind. The story world itself, you can imagine it as being populated by agents that interact with each other. So we learn about how they interact, how humans interact with each other. We learn some psychology in that case. But you also learn how the agents interact with their physical environment, all of them differently, and the complete dynamic of what is going on in a novel, in that story being told there, is created by the totality of these interactions between agents and story world environment. And maybe you can see that the analogy holds. If we see physics as a science of forces of nature, if we allow ourselves to represent these forces of nature as agents in our mind, agents that have certain properties that allow them to interact in certain ways, but the forces don't just interact with each other, they also interact with their physical environment. For instance, if the agent called heat is supposed to go from A to B, but you put up a block there, you put in some thermal insulation, then the physical environment alters the the concrete dynamics of this interaction, and so on and so on. So we really have quite a similarity between story worlds and model worlds. So if you, as a scientist or an engineer, narratively talks about, explains what is going on in a system, this basically takes the form of a story, and a hearer of that narrative explanation will probably create something like a model world in his or her mind, and so become able to create ideas for a dynamical model. Okay, and with this, I would like to stop and already apologize for taking more time than was allotted. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Fuchs. We will please type in your questions in the chat box or raise your hands. So there's a question from Sanjay. Sanjay, you want to speak?
Please.
Yeah, hi. Very interesting talk. Yeah. So I have this question. So where, see, there are multiple kinds of story structures possible, right? So the one that you are highlighting is the one where there is an agent, there is one agent or multiple agents, and they overcome some tension, and there is, some goal that is reached, which is a sort of linear story. But then you can also have some kind of circular or spiraling stories, like the 1001 Nights or Mahabharata or something, where there are stories that are embedded in stories, and the narrative just keeps expanding. So does understanding physics require you to sort of subscribe to the linear and have a preference for that linear kind of story? And a continuing question is, if your argument is right, then, in the other kind of, if you are, so this is, physics is exploring one kind of causality using this kind of narrative. Are there other kinds of causalities possible, similar to the 1001 Nights and Mahabharata, where there are spiraling and, there is maybe other kinds of physics out there which is like not caught through the linear causal kind of models. I mean, this is just a sort of provocative question. Just ask
This is,
because it is related to the problem of learning also. Because if you are growing up with a different kind of story, and then you are told a sort of mechanism, causal kind of story, you might have a some kind of mismatch there.
Okay. What I talked about, what I presented here is, I believe, limited in that sense you have been pointing out. I think so. So I would agree with you that what I presented doesn't directly or easily or right away give us an answer to your questions, which I believe will expand the world of science, or our activity in the world of science, learning, etc., etc. Okay, so very generally, we have to expand upon what I said. The question is if what I said and what I presented would be something like a story, a subplot in a larger, and you referred to this the spiraling multiple stories of 1001 Night. But before we look at that, let me ask you something. You said linear story, just that we understand this, because you can have, and I would say usually you have feedback in a story. So I don't know if you still would call a story that brings up feedback as a major issue. For example, a story about well, the natural world around us, a story of wind. I'll come to this in a minute. It brings up the notion of feedback if this is linear in your sense. Let me quickly mention what I mean. There's a very nice story told by groups of North American Indians, North American natives. It's Why We Need Wind. And it's a story about this hero who goes out on the water to hunt ducks. And he's always driven back on land by wind. He gets annoyed. He asks his grandmother, where does the wind live? I want to turn that wind off. His grandmother tells him he goes up into the mountains where the wind lives. And he catches the wind, throws him down into a crevice so that the wind cannot blow anymore. He goes back down to the ocean, goes out on the water, hunts ducks, but because there's no wind, the water becomes foul, the air starts to stink, etc., etc. So he's unhappy again. The hero goes back up into the mountains, frees the wind, and has a kind of agreement with wind that wind would blow only at times intermittently. So you have this story that gives you a feeling of the importance of how we humans interact with nature, how it should interact this, and you see this through the feedback loop that is occurring there. Now, feedback would not be called a linear element in a model. Okay, Sanjay.
Yeah, I agree with that. So there is, but it's still sort of goal directed, right? So there is a sort of, so there is,
right.
I mean, a similar story would be the Frog Prince, the Frog Princess, where there is like some other things that happen.
Right.
But there is a sort of directionality to it. There is the sense in which I meant linear.
Okay, let's call it linear in that sense. And you referred to interacting stories in 1001 Night. Could the learning of natural science, maybe less physics, but natural science, maybe if you studied ecology, you really have to bring together much more than what you just learn in physics, and you don't just have the physical agents, you have humans interacting with an ecological environment as well, etc., etc. Let's say you want to render this learning narratively. I assume you would use a number of different types of stories, talking about different environments, different agents. And one story might suggest to use another story. Maybe a little bit like this, the story of the Apple story, or Marion Deichmann's story of fuel cells and hydrogen, that you have a story involving human or whatever agents, and in there you have subplots telling their own stories. Okay, honestly, essentially, I've not thought about this yet. So thank you for this question. It brings up something I have not considered enough. I'm just thinking about it now, and it's definitely important and interesting. So maybe learning more than just physics would mean that we use a model of narrative that is enlarged compared to this one. However, maybe I'm making a mistake, but maybe you noticed in what I said there. If you want to tell a story, it seems there are always agents. There are always tensions and agents and events.
Yeah, that is correct. Actually, Alak has a very nice response to me. So he says that the standard model of matter is more like this 1001 Nights kind of story. Right?
Probably,
Alak,
yes,
yeah.
yes. Mm-hmm.
Actually, I said Mahabharata.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they are similar in that sense.
Yeah, like you want to elaborate on that, and then we can go to Charu's question. So that
no, I think I have. I've just said it. I mean, I was just having a discussion with Sanjay, which I can have it separately.
Okay. Charu has a question. Charu, go ahead.
Hi, thank you much for the talk. I had a question about the narrator of the narrative, who is generally in the background. And
give me that
so
the sound is not good enough.
Is it
Maybe
better now? Or you can just read the
just
question.
Go ahead. Maybe Mashood understands you better than I do. The sound is not good, but maybe we'll get it.
Go ahead.
Please
Charu.
go ahead.
Yeah, if it is breaking, then I will.
Yeah, I was wondering about who the narrator of the narrative is. So can we also explicitly focus on the narrator, because the narrators also have their own biases, values, motivations to tell the particular story. So my question is coming from feminist science studies or social and cultural construction of knowledge. So can we think of multiple point of view narratives? Like there are different characters who each tell the story from their own perspective. And the science is a meta-narrative of all these different narratives.
Okay, forgive me. Basically, I only understood that your question is about the role of the narrator. Is that correct?
So yeah, I will. So his
yeah,
question
Mashood,
is
maybe.
Yeah, his question is about the narrator of the narratives. Will it help to explicitly focus on the narrator as well? Can there be multiple points of view narratives? For example, he gives Game of Thrones, different characters tell story from their perspective. So can there be multiple points of narratives in science? And his question is coming from feminist science studies, social and cultural construction of science.
Okay, the first part of your question, I would say definitely yes. Different narrators, really in concrete terms, maybe there are two teachers there, and each talking about the same subject, the same theme, but they do take different perspectives, and the stories they tell or the narratives they create will not be the same. They come from different perspectives, but they will be about the same subject. So there, I believe, if I understand right, that my answer to the first part of the question would be yes, and it would be important to have different perspectives in education if we don't just concentrate on some part of a physical theory and we have to learn that and we have to learn the math for this. But if we take a much wider view, then the point of different perspectives, which can be taken by different narrators, is important. Okay, so I don't know if I understood that first part correctly, and there my answer would be yes. And especially if you take a narrative approach to science teaching and learning, this would allow you to, it would be a vehicle, would probably be a much stronger vehicle for taking different perspectives than, well, I can't think of any other way of doing this. Mashoud, there was this then.
There's an the second part was like where he clarified where this is coming from. It is coming from feminist science studies, social, cultural construction of science. So not a question, more than it's like a qualifier.
Well, I mean, that would be worth a very, very prolonged discussion. Constructing science, where does science come from, et cetera, et cetera. I believe what I presented today is a very modest contribution to this issue of where science comes from, okay? Maybe in this, what I concentrated on, where does understanding of certain aspects of nature and technical systems arise in. But it may be a contribution to a wider and enlarged model of the construction of science.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question from Chaitanya. Chaitanya, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so yeah, so I was actually thinking about stories in the context of evolution. So in biology education, there's actually this problem of teleological thinking. So students tend to think that evolution is goal directed, whereas like what we know, what we know is that it's not really, there's no end as such to it. It is simply an outcome of how organisms and their genes are interacting with their environment. So now if we think of forces of nature, evolutionary forces as agents, like in this narrative structure, are we creating a kind of problem for ourselves? Are we setting it up as these are agents, they're going to have adventures, whereas what the science tells us is that there are no goals. So that was my question. Yeah.
Okay, I'm aware of this issue, but I'm not the one who has the answer for this. I have thought about this, and I can tell you a few things that may relate to this. Just very quickly, toward the end, you said something about goal-directed. Now, naturally, we have this, how should I say, this impression of agents being goal-directed from human agents. I didn't say anything about this here, but I believe that the feeling of agency is more general than that which comes out directly through, well, call it psychology or whatever, human interaction. Maybe more like how a child would experience ghosts. The ghosts don't necessarily have to be goal-directed. So yeah, I didn't say anything about this, but I believe that the model of agency and agents is wider in that sense and needs to be used in stories of forces of nature, as I have done. And we do not have to imply goal-directedness. We do not have to imply intentionality, etc., etc. Okay. Having said this, being somebody who tells stories of forces of nature, how would I deal with the issue of evolution? I've wondered about this, but I've not created anything to say this is how it works. I wonder, first of all, we have to clarify very carefully what would be agents in this case. You know, are you talking about evolution, the change in DNA? Are you talking about the phenotype? You know, there are animals living in an area. Some of them are being cut off by a landslide from those, and they evolve differently. Anyway, but let's assume we have found agents. A question I had for myself was, is it enough to add chance to this? Chance in how certain traits evolve, change in some of the individuals there. I have created a dynamical model, totally without chance, of 3 species interacting: lions, antelopes, and grass. Okay, what you get is a chaotic system, but it is chaotic without any chance. What you can do is you can multiply the structure of the model with these 3 species. Maybe you multiply maybe the antelopes. You have 2 types of antelopes, and by chance, a feature of the second group of antelopes, for example, how much food they need, basically, in order to survive, changes by chance in a certain direction in this species, which then gives that group in the model, gives that group of antelopes an advantage or disadvantage relative to the other one. Honestly, I am not an expert in evolution. I just played around with it. And as I said, I have been wondering for myself if storytelling can continue, as I have said, with this imagery of forces of nature, etc., plus an element of chance. There is something which was discussed by one of the players in the mechanisms, in the field of the philosophy of mechanisms, and that is Stuart Glennon. He has come up with this idea of ephemeral mechanisms, where the constitution of a mechanism is ephemeral in the sense things come together by chance. It uses the example of Roland Barthes, an important French philosopher, being run over by a truck in Paris after he had lunch with the president of the French Republic. Okay, and so here a mechanism was constituted by chance, briefly, right then and there, and dissipated again, and Roland Barthes was killed. So what I have called the story world here, the story world environment, that this can be constituted by chance, that the agents that come up can be constituted, a new agent can come up, etc., all by chance. I don't know if this is enough in order to approach evolution.
Thank you. And we have another questions from Sanjay, and with it, if there are no further questions, we can end. So, Sanjay, go ahead.
Yeah, I had this question about equations. So in this way of thinking, the equations are formed through a sort of funneling process. So the forces of nature
Pardon, the equations are formed
through a funneling process. Funneling as in the forces of nature narratives are transformed systematically. So you take the forces of narrative, turn it into a schematic, then you turn it into a geometric representation, then you turn it into an algebraic representation, and then you
formalize.
Yeah,
I call that the process of formalizing. Yes.
Yeah, but you can think of it as a funnel structure where a lot of details slowly disappear, and eventually you arrive at a mathematical characterization where the equation is essentially a loading of reality into symbolic structure through multiple stages. Okay. So now two questions. One is the equation also mentally simulatable because it is going through this process? Secondly, is the part of the expertise in physics the capacity to mentally simulate equations, like keeping both the simulations alive at the same time? So I have the mathematical simulation on one side, like I am thinking of the equation and thinking of how the variables are changing, while also keeping the starting narrative, the reality narrative, the agents and the story world alive. So, and comparing between them. Is this one of the ways in which, physicists, is this part of the expertise of physics? So this is my first question. The second is, what is this, equality operator? Like, what is the role of the equality operator? The equality operator.
The equality operator. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't understand. The equality of?
Equality operator.
Operator.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So in the narrative, that operator has some role, like it is creating this balance, right? So, so what does it do? Like, and how does we, what is the relationship between the forces of nature idea and this equality business, which is leading to this equation structure?
I must confess, I haven't thought about it in these terms. Let me see if I can say something there. Forces of nature, particular force, water, has its aspects of amount and tension, and it's powerful. Now, as you tell such a story about water, you will not speak formally. You will probably suggest, or the story will suggest, that the power of this agent increases with the tension and increases with the size or amount of this agent. So qualitatively. So how powerful this agent is, I'll move toward a little bit more formally, being a little bit more formally. Imagine a waterfall. The tension is the level difference, the height of the waterfall, and the amount for the power is the flow of water, the magnitude of the flow of water. So a story about a waterfall would suggest in the mind of the hearer that there is such a relationship between the tension, the extensive aspect, and how powerful this phenomenon, this force of nature is. Okay, and now as I formalize this, I would ask, well, how does making the tension higher, how does that change the power? Maybe proportionally. How does the increasing the amount of water that flows down, if I have two waterfalls or three identical ones instead of one, how does that change the power of the phenomenon? Maybe also by direct proportionality. And so thinking about this, how I could render this quantitatively, I would then say, let me try if it makes sense that the power of a waterfall could be expressed as being equal to the product of these two fundamental aspects. And there I have the equal sign. Now, Sanjay, I don't know if I have been going in the direction of your question.
Yes, yeah. So, but see, the general idea is, so the qualitative story that we tell would be understandable to students to some extent. But when you mathematize it, one of the things that you do is you create this equality between two sides. So understanding that relationship and what we do with that relationship is the most difficult part. So I was just thinking whether the narrative idea can give us some handle on this establishment of the equality operator, right? I mean, the use of the equality operator to create a balance.
Yeah.
And is there a narrative way of understanding it?
There, imaginative or figurative ways, yes. There is an important paper about understanding equations in physics. I believe that's the title. I forget the name of the author.
Bruce
Somebody
Sherin.
who's...
It's Bruce Sherin, is it?
Yes. Thank you very much, Mashoud. Yes. There's more to mathematics than just the direct naked manipulation of symbols on a page of paper. But I'm not an expert in this. Now, Sanjay, you're right. There is still quite a distance to go from the from the story that, let me put it this way again, in the sense of in the words I've been using, that suggests a model world, a story world, a model world that suggests ideas for relations. Now, then comes the hard work of saying how you would like to create, render this relationship. And then comes the hard work of learning math so that you can manipulate the statements. It's, I don't know if this makes sense, if this answers anything. Probably for most scientists, mathematics is a language. Maybe not for every mathematician, but for engineers and scientists, math is a language. So we have to learn a new language. However, it's the meaning of the things. And for example, we get a result by manipulating the words in that new language. The meaning of that result, and also the meaning of what we have done as we've manipulated the symbols in that language, the meaning of all of that is still narrative, is still imaginative, is still figurative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there is a way in which that formalism is built, which is difficult to understand. Right? I mean that. So initially you had shown this figure where there was an equation on top. No, there was a phenomena on top, and there were equations, and you were showing the relationship between the equations. Yeah, this one.
Or this one. Yeah,
or this one. Yes, but see, what was missing is that you had the mapping from the quantities, but that equality operator was, in some sense, kind of mysterious.
Right, right. But I really believe this is figurative, imaginative as well. How do they combine? How does the content? Let's take water. The amount of water in a reservoir. How does that change? First of all, why is it possible for the amount of water to change in a reservoir? Well, we believe because water can flow in and out. So now, can math give us that understanding? I would say no. So really, there is this fundamental imaginative understanding of the world around us that gives us certain images of how things work, and we use them, we try them, and they are like suggestions for us to try out mathematically. There is nothing in mathematics that suggests the equal sign. There's nothing in mathematics that suggests this balance here. By the way, the question, why is this called a law of balance? Balance, has something to do with our balance or imbalance of the human. You walk and you stumble over a stone and you almost fall. You lose your balance, equilibrium. This is something that's given to us that is created in us as we interact with our environments. There are structures of understanding, of meaning, of knowledge that are not mathematical, that or are not given by mathematics. For me, it is
so
almost.
Yeah, that was the sort of rough. So when physics uses the equality operator, is it appealing to our inherent ideas, sensory motor ideas about equilibrium?
For example, yes.
Yes, and the law of conservation that we work with are essentially formalizations of our sense of equilibrium. Whether that is a direction that, like if you want to add a annotation to that equality operator there, like maybe it actually might go a lot deeper than, what I'm saying here.
Thank you for suggesting that.
Thank you. Hans, it's almost, it's 5 here and 1:30 there. Would you like to take another questions, or should we call it a day?
I still have a few minutes before I have to move on.
Okay,
but
then
it is evening for you. So
people, if you have other commitments, you are free to leave. Those who would like to stay can, because Hans conveyed that he will be there for another few minutes more. So we have one more question by Jeanette. Where does scientific inquiry or experimentation plays in, which is generally used to challenge pseudoscience and alternative science narrative?
Could you say this? So how does experiment?
Plays in, which is generally used to challenge pseudoscience and alternative science narrative. I understand this question because if we focus exclusively on the narrative, we can't distinguish between a pseudoscience narrative or a faulty narrative and a narrative that is that has predictive value. So for that, experiment has to come in, right, into this whole story.
Yes, consider experimenting as a form of activity that gives us experience. Experience, be it I'm walking outside and a storm is coming up and I feel wind and form the images of wind as a force of nature, or I engage in the activity of setting up an experiment and conducting an experiment in the lab. Seen from a general viewpoint, all of this leads to experience. Now, we do want to be able to talk about experience, what we experience, and by the way, not just I experience, I alone, but what we can experience together in a group. Joint experience, joint activity, etc., etc. And we have to come together on this, agree on the experience given to us, presented to us in the activities which we form. The thing about metaphor and schemas and analogy and narrative is simply an aspect of doing science, namely the aspect of when we start talking to each other about our experience, when we start explaining, when we start, well, model building. And with that word, I'm in the middle of, well, formalizing what I do, quantifying what I do. And once I do that, if I have a quantifiable model and I have quantified experience from an experiment, I want to bring the two together. I want to bring the result of the model simulation, which feels like a story. I want to bring it together with what I have seen in the laboratory. That is the business of science. Okay.
No, in that sense, if experience is like a constructed, it's like a constructed one, a fabricated one, which we create in the lab, isn't it that a parallel narrative? So can we not consider the process of science as having two parallel narratives, one the experimental route to modeling, and one the theoretical route to modeling, and these two narratives, the match or the mismatch of these two narratives settling the issue?
Okay, if I understand you right, I believe it's basically what I just said, the way I work in the sciences. Okay. I have an idea of what interests me, what I would like to do. I might start with setting up an experiment in the lab, which allows me to investigate this. For example, what I've done in recent years is thermoelectricity. So I work with generators in the lab. I get data. At the same time, I'm explaining to myself what is going on. Pretty much the same time, I'm starting to create dynamical computer models of what I believe I have there. The model will allow me to create a simulation, and the experiment furnishes data. And I bring the two together. Is that what you meant?
Yes, that's what exactly I meant. But the addition is that, can we consider experiment also as a narrative on its own? Does that make sense?
I'm trying to think about this.
Okay.
If narrative is the stories we tell each other, then maybe engaging in experimenting per se is not. But I mean, experimenting has a number of aspects, you know. Let's put it that way. The experimental setup, as you let it run,
Mhm.
produces, let me call it a simulation. It's a simulation of that apparatus.
Okay.
The apparatus is a physical object that could be the environment, the physical environment for the simulation this experiment runs.
Mhm.
Yeah, in the way I've been talking about this before, okay, you have this physical object which can serve as the background for forces of nature. They act and they run there. They run a simulation, and if you have some equipment hooked up to your experiment, it will show you numbers. It will show you a curve on a monitor, and that is the equivalent of a story being told. Yes, I guess. Thank you very much for this question.
So if I add on to it, instead of language dominating in our usual narrative, there are material artifacts. I mean,
Yes,
this is just
yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
something that came right to me.
Naturally, all this doesn't make sense if the experiment just runs by itself and you're not going to be in the lab. If you're not going to pick up the data, if you haven't created the experiment, and if you're not picking up on the data it gives you as it runs. But in a way, I believe what I've just done is put myself in a different world. Yeah, in a world of this stuff in my lab doing things, undergoing change. There's the physical object itself, which is the physical scene upon which forces of nature are active that tell the story, that run a simulation, that tell a story. But naturally, looking at it that way only makes sense once we step in. Maybe we can explain to a learner or somebody, a friend, what we are doing when we experiment. It has a little bit something to do with this. It's yes, the like we might, if you want to. Let's not do take an experiment. Let's take a piece of nature, a tree growing in your garden. It does that. And if you now go and create a story of that apple tree, and now you are putting yourself in the shoes of that tree and the force of nature active in that tree. So maybe we can make that transfer from us being the storytellers to nature being the storyteller.
Okay, thank you, Hans, for such a wonderful talk and providing us with an overview and introducing us to literature in this field. And thank you all who are still remaining for patiently listening and participating. Let us put together our hands to formally thank Professor Fuchs for his wonderful seminar.
I thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. It was great fun. Thank you.
Yeah, we hope to work with you, write to you about what we are doing.
We'll stay in touch.
Yes.
Mashoud has my coordinates. I have his. So please use the opportunity, and yes, we'll stay in touch.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And
bye.
Goodbye. Have a nice evening.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye. Nice lunch.
Okay, Mashoud, I would like to. Mashoud's gone.